let's talk about Brandon Aiyuk real quick. So the report, there's been multiple reports, I guess. Benjamin Albright put out a screenshot yesterday on Twitter of a conversation that he had that said that the Steelers were pursuing Brandon Aiyuk, which this conversation took place in March. And then as murmurs started, piling back up over the past couple of days of Brandon Aiyuk potentially requesting a trade. And then a fellow by the name of John Friskella saying that Brandon Aiyuk has requested a trade, although, as we were talking about in the lobby, maybe take that with a grain of salt, depending on where this is going. But regardless, this has been a talking point for Steelers fans over the past few weeks, after Brandon Aiyuk tweeted for the first time in over a year, and his tweet saying, directed at Mike Tomlin saying, "Hey, I heard we look alike." And that caused waves throughout Steelers Twitter to be like, "Oh my God, they're really doing this." Things have died down, and now they seem to be picking back up. Where do you fall in terms of all of this?
Which, by the way, they do look alike. I mean, I put the post up of them, and then that ended up being on the Pat McAfee show. Somebody did a face swap, giving Tomlin the dreads and everything like that. But no, this goes back very far. I mean, the Steelers have been turning every possible stone in this wide receiver market, clearly. I had put out a while ago talking to somebody from San Fran that they were asking about Deebo Samuel. So those conversations, I'm sure they called San Fran and were asking about both. Because those are just the conversations that happen. That's just doing due diligence. And if your GM is not doing that, they're not a very good GM if they're not finding out who's available. Same thing with Terry McLaurin in Washington, although that sounded like it was the Steelers asking, Washington telling them to screw off, and then they hung up the phone. But Brandon Aiyuk is a fantastic player. I mean, every team should want a player like Brandon Aiyuk. Was number 7 last year in receiving yards, second only behind George Pickens in terms of yards per reception. Still just 24 years old. Obviously, a big payday is coming his way, and that is probably, really the center of where these conversations are being had. He wants paid. They already have a highly paid receiver there in the aforementioned Deebo Samuel. So, what does it look like for Brandon Aiyuk, whether that is in San Fran or somewhere else? I'm really interested in that. And at the same time, I think now is the time to do this because it's before CeeDee Lamb, before Justin Jefferson really blow up this wide receiver market. $22 to $25 million per year, assuming it's somewhere within that range, I think will look like a steal once, Justin Jefferson gets 30, CeeDee Lamb gets 28-ish, whatever that might be. But yeah, Brandon Aiyuk is a fantastic player. I don't know what the acquisition cost would be, but I think anybody that doesn't want him on their football team before even knowing what the team is giving up is just a bonehead.
Yeah, and I had DB on here either last week or the week prior, absolutely. And he made a really good point that's really stuck with me. He's like, you are what you invest in. So the Steelers can't complain. Steelers fans can't complain if the receivers room's bad, if they're not willing to make a move like this and to, go out and get a Brandon Aiyuk. And you can't go into the season with your wide receiver 2 being Van Jefferson or Calvin Austin or Quez Watkins like that. I don't see that being
right now. Their wide receiver 2 is Pat Freiermuth.
Sure. Yeah. But in terms of, a move like this, you talked about it looking like a steal down the road. We're seeing that right now with the defensive line market where the Bills paid Ed Oliver, what looked like, oh, that's a lot of money for Ed Oliver. But then over the past few weeks, all of these defensive linemen, defensive ends getting ginormous money. And now Ed Oliver is like the 9th highest paid at his position. So it's better to get ahead of this and maybe, look a little bit like, okay, that's a lot of money right now. But like you said, when Justin Jefferson eventually gets $30 million a year, when CeeDee Lamb eventually gets close to $30 million a year, you're looking at what you're paying Brandon Aiyuk, which, like you said, could be between 22 and 25. That's going to look like, oh, okay, for Brandon Aiyuk, that's pretty good value. In terms of what they'd have to give up, a lot of people are saying it'll probably be, the AJ Brown trade where it's a first and a third.
Yeah,
I understand why people would say that, but the receiver market, the trade market this offseason says that's not what it's going to be. We saw Jerry Jeudy go for a pair of day 3s. We saw Deontay Johnson get traded for a day 3 and a player. I just don't see if it came a few years ago, maybe, but the receiver market this year says that's probably not. No, Brandon Aiyuk is better than Jerry Jeudy. Brandon Aiyuk is better than Deontay Johnson. But the jump to go from, okay, this guy's going for a day 3 pick to, okay, a first and a third, I just don't know if that's there. I could see, a second and a third. The Steelers have 2/3 as well in this year's draft if they wanted to say, hey, 2/3 for Brandon Aiyuk, maybe. I don't know what the what the compensation is going to go down as, just because it's been so unpredictable this year. But let's say that it is the AJ Brown trade. Would you be comfortable saying, okay, first and a third for Brandon Aiyuk?
Are they in the same year?
That I was going to get to that, because what if they split the difference? Like, okay, how about a first this year, third next year? Or if they somehow pull it off, like, hey, we'll give you 84 this year and then our first round pick next year. What do you say?
Right.
If they're able to do that, then I'm in.
Yeah, that's a lot more. I mean, I think that I still do it right, but I think 84 in the first next year is even more palatable, just because you're still able to address the offensive line needs that you have in the slot corner. Like, you're kind of giving one of those up, being able to check that box if you make this Aiyuk trade. But doing it in the first round is obviously, unless you're talking about like a swap, like if they could do 20 for 31 and then 84 and then the first next year, something like that, whatever it might be. But as long as you're able to still keep a first rounder this year, I think that I'm fully on board with it. But yeah, the conversation surrounding this has just been insane to me. Like, I think that there's a lot of people maybe underrating Brandon Aiyuk and also overrating the value that you're going to get at receiver in the draft. I get it. Like, these draft classes do come out more pro ready more and more every year. And maybe that is also playing into the diminishing return for receivers as well. Cause like having that foresight with the salary cap going up, I think GMs also have the foresight in terms of what these receivers are coming out and how pro ready they are. At the same time, you can't just be expecting that you're going to draft a guy like Brandon Aiyuk every single year. Like, there are maybe 3 guys in this draft class that are going to be that type of receiver, hopefully be that type of receiver. And that's not even a guarantee. Like, listen, I love Marvin Harrison Jr., Rome Odunze, and Malik Neighbors, but like, do I expect them to be wide receiver ones for their respective teams? Sure, but there's no guarantee there. And I can guarantee you that Brandon Aiyuk is a number 1 wide receiver. So I don't know. I just think that at some point in time, we've kind of lost that thought process where people are just like, oh, you can just draft a receiver and they're going to be a stud.
And I've had this conversation with so many people, is if you can get Brandon Aiyuk, you get Brandon Aiyuk. It's the Family Guy, the mystery box with the boat situation. Oh, it could be a boat, but the mystery box could be anything. It could even be a boat, We had a similar situation like this a few years ago when CeeDee Lamb, Henry Ruggs, and Jerry Jeudy were all coming out. Everybody's like, oh, these are 3 studs, can't miss guys. And CeeDee Lamb ended up being really good. Jerry Jeudy is fine, and we unfortunately know what happened with Henry Ruggs. But I hate the notion that, like, oh, you can just draft a guy and he'll be fine. No, you can't. You can't bank on that. Even with the Steelers' history of being good at drafting receivers, like, it's very, very slim chances that whoever they take, even if Ricky Pearsall, which people seem to really like, or Malachi Corley, like, there's a very slim chance that either of them end up being as good as Brandon Aiyuk. And if you can get somebody who is as good on the outside as Brandon Aiyuk, you do it. There should be no conversation about this. And everybody's always like, you can't trade a first round pick for Brandon Aiyuk. Oh, watch me, dude.